General Hospital spoilers reveal that the revelation came not with fanfare, but in the cold, clinical silence of Dalton's underground facility, an echoing space where secrets had been buried beneath layers of science and denial. Professor Henry Hank Dalton had long prided himself on being a visionary, a man driven by the pursuit of medical innovation. Yet in the stillness of his lab that night, as the truth finally surfaced, his reflection on the polished steel cabinets was not that of a pioneer, but of a pawn. Victor Cassadine, presumed dead and mourned only by those naive enough to believe it, was the one funding and directing the controversial experiments from the shadows. The man who once sought to control the world through weather machines and viral warfare had evolved his obsession into something far more intimate, dominion over death itself. Dalton's admission shattered more than just the illusion of independence, it shifted the very foundation of the research. What was once seen as advanced regenerative therapy now bore the stench of darker intentions. The documents Dalton had once received under the guise of anonymous benefactors suddenly took on a sinister tone, their language coded not in science but in power. Every note, every formula, every unexplained directive that had puzzled him for months now made sense in the most terrifying way imaginable. Victor had never stopped playing God, he had simply changed the game board. The change was subtle at first. Funding had increased. Specialized equipment, untraceable, military grade, and decades ahead of its time, began to arrive under vague shipping manifests. Biological samples that Dalton was instructed not to question appeared in cryogenic tanks. Test subjects were no longer drawn from terminally ill volunteers but rather from unnamed, undocumented sources. When he asked questions, silence was the only answer he received. And now, it was clear, those silences were Victor's fingerprints, pressing down on the pulse of the lab with calculated menace. This revelation ushered in what could only be described as a shift in atmosphere, as if the very air in the lab had thickened with dread. The new directive was no longer about preserving life, it was about manipulating it. Death, in Victor's design, was not an end but a barrier to be shattered. Dalton, once a man of data and ethics, found himself descending into a nightmare where ethics were fluid and science bent to the will of a ghost. Victor's apparent resurrection, if not in body, then certainly in influence, wasn't just a twist in the tale. It was a declaration, he had returned, and this time, he wouldn't be constrained by the mortal limits of flesh or law. Sidwell's growing agitation now seemed less about impatience and more about fear. The so-called courier Victor had dispatched was no simple messenger, it was a warning shot. A human embodiment of the consequences of delay. Sidwell's voice, once commanding and curt, trembled slightly when he spoke of Victor. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that being on Victor's payroll meant being within his grip. And Dalton, now fully aware of who held the leash, felt the weight of that grip tighten around his throat with every passing hour. More troubling still was the realization that Victor's interest in the lab wasn't arbitrary. His obsession with Liesl Albrecht had always bordered on the pathological, and her daughter, Britt Westbourne, was a direct link to that compulsion. The lab, with all its regenerative research and cloning theories, could offer Victor the one thing he had never possessed, the power to reclaim what was lost. Britt's rumored survival, though dismissed by many as tabloid fantasy, suddenly carried the weight of possibility. If the lab had succeeded in even a fraction of what Victor envisioned, Britt could very well be alive, rebuilt, reprogrammed, and reborn in service to her creator's twisted vision. Dalton could no longer sleep. Each night brought dreams of Victor, not as the aged tyrant who once threatened Port Charles, but as something new. Something colder, more calculating. A mind without limits. A phantom with a laboratory. Every flickering light in the lab became a potential surveillance feed. Every voice over the intercom, distorted and mechanical, seemed like Victor whispering from the abyss. The lines between life and death, master and servant, science and sorcery, had blurred beyond recognition. The implications for Port Charles were vast. Victor had never been content with whispers in the dark. If he had returned, if he had embedded himself this deeply into the very institutions meant to safeguard life, then it was only a matter of time before his reach extended outward. Windmere, now in Sidwell's possession, was likely no coincidence. That estate had always been the heart of the Cassadine legacy, an altar to generations of madness and manipulation. With it under Victor's influence once more. The signal was clear, the Cassadine dynasty was not finished. It was regenerating, cell by cell, plan by plan. The silence surrounding Alexis Davis and the Cassadine dagger was no longer incidental. Either. The family relic, laced with centuries of dark myth, had resurfaced under suspicious circumstances. Its sudden reappearance, paired with Victor's manipulations, hinted at ritual as much as science. Perhaps to Victor, the two were now indistinguishable. Dalton found himself haunted by the possibility that his lab was not a research facility but a temple, where life was not studied, but sacrificed and reshaped. Worse still was the dawning realization that Victor might not be working alone. Albrecht's rumored return, coupled with the unexplained gaps in Britt's medical history and the eerie absence of public records, suggested a network of loyalists or, worse, constructs. Who else had Victor touched? Who else had been pulled into his resurrectionist crusade? And if he could alter the body, could he also alter the mind? The corridors of the lab grew colder. The walls, once sterile white, now felt oppressive, closing in like the pages of a book Victor had already written. Dalton, once the architect of the future, had become a relic of his own design. A man forced to question whether the knowledge he pursued had ever been his to begin with. Each time he touched a microscope, he wondered if Victor was watching through its lens. Each time he entered a password, he wondered if Victor had written the code. This was no longer just a project. It was a possession. And as the days passed, as more shipments arrived without origin, as Sidwell's voice grew quieter and more paranoid, as the lab's energy subtly shifted from innovation to indoctrination, Dalton knew, the world outside still believed Victor Cassadine was dead. But the world inside that lab? It belonged to him now. And the most chilling change of all wasn't that Victor might still be alive. It was that he might never have needed a body to rule again. In the deepest levels of Dalton's research compound, beneath the sterile halls and flickering lights that masked the true horror of what had been set in motion, a darker truth had begun to fester, one that redefined every boundary of science, morality, and madness. It was no longer just about experiments or funding. It was about control, about obsession, and about the terrifying reality that two individuals, Morgan Britt and Britt Westbourne, may not be lost at all. They may be trapped, experimented upon, hidden behind reinforced doors and buried in the silence of a lab that had long ceased to serve the living. Whispers first emerged as inconsistencies. Dalton's staff, those few who remained ignorant of the true nature of the facility, began noticing strange anomalies. Rooms marked off limits for safety reasons. Corridors that had appeared on the original blueprints but no longer connected in reality, surveillance feeds blacked out or looped. There were reports of faint screams muffled behind soundproofed walls, of distorted heart monitor readings that didn't match any registered patient, of medical files that had no names. Only code names, Subject M and Subject B. At first, Dalton dismissed these anomalies as procedural irregularities. But deep inside, he knew better. He had heard the rumors. The night he discovered the true identity of the benefactor behind his research, Victor Cassadine, was also the night he lost control of his own facility. What had once been a research program was now a prison, and he was its warden in name only. Morgan Britt, long presumed dead after being caught in a car bomb explosion, was no stranger to twisted fates and family vendettas. If Victor had found a way to preserve him, whether as a living captive or as part of some grotesque reanimation process, then Dalton's lab had crossed into something unholy. Similarly, Britt Westbourne, once thought lost to time and tragedy, now stood at the heart of this unfolding madness. Her supposed return was not the miracle it appeared to be, but a symptom of something far more sinister, a science project under Victor's warped command. Dalton's hands were no longer clean. He could not deny the biometric data logged under the Subject M and Subject B files. The DNA samples were conclusive. They matched Morgan and Britt perfectly. Their vitals fluctuated in erratic patterns consistent with long-term sedation and experimental modulation. They weren't just being held, they were being altered. Victor, even in supposed death, remained the master puppeteer. He had always thrived on manipulation, on reshaping others in his own image. Kidnapping had been one of his oldest and most effective tools, whether it was Laura Spencer, Liesel Albrecht, or Nicholas. But this was different. This was not about ransom, leverage, or political power. This was about building something new from something broken. And in Morgan and Britt, he had found his perfect test subjects, one with a fractured psyche and a bloodline connected to chaos, the other with a genius-level intellect and a mother who had once danced with darkness. The lab, under Victor's design, had become a tomb for identities. Memory suppression, neurological rewiring, synthetic hormonal rebalancing, every form of experimental conditioning was being used. Dalton, despite his growing horror, couldn't look away from the results. Morgan's aggression levels were being suppressed chemically, replaced with passive compliance. Britt's cognitive function had been mapped, mirrored, and overridden with behavioral patterns that Victor personally dictated through encrypted files labeled Restoration Protocol. And yet, it wasn't just about control. It was about transformation. Victor believed the future lay not in preserving people, but in perfecting them. Morgan's trauma made him a malleable canvas. And Britt's medical expertise, hijacked and repurposed, made her an architect of her own undoing. What Dalton was witnessing wasn't recovery. It was resurrection of the worst kind. Every adjustment in the program revealed how deep Victor's obsession ran. New chambers were installed overnight without Dalton's authorization. Custom-built neural scanners, years ahead of what the public believed possible, arrived with instructions written in Victor's signature diction. Even Dalton's own credentials were being used to authorize procedures he had no memory of approving. His fingerprints, his retinal scans, spoofed, copied, used against him. The lab had become a weaponized extension of Victor's will, and Dalton, despite being the head scientist, had become just another subject of manipulation. Even more disturbing was what the tests revealed. Morgan's brainwave patterns no longer aligned with standard cognitive models. His identity, fragmented as it had always been, now showed signs of external scripting, memories inserted, emotions dulled, responses rerouted through artificial neural links. He wasn't just being detained. He was being rewritten. And Britt, though physically stable, had begun showing signs of suggestive responsiveness, her eyes flickering open and closed as if cycling through dream states programmed into her like a machine waiting for commands. The walls of the lab closed in, every hum of the machinery sounding like a heartbeat not their own. Dalton, sleepless and riddled with guilt, began to see hallucinations, of Morgan screaming behind glass, of Britt mouthing words he could not hear but somehow understood, "Let me go." He started to document everything in a hidden journal. Unsure if he was the last sane mind left or simply the last to fully collapse into Victor's vision. Security protocols intensified. Guards, no longer the private contractors Dalton had hired, but Cassadine loyalists flown in under medical pretenses, patrolled with militarized precision. Dalton's lab access was reduced. Files were redacted. Even the mainframe he had built with his own hands now rejected his login credentials. He was being erased. And so were they. Outside Port Charles, life continued in its tragic cycles. But within the cold corridors of the lab, reality had splintered. Victor's madness was not explosive or theatrical, it was methodical, strategic, and irreversible. He didn't just want to bring Morgan and Britt back. He wanted to recreate them. He wanted obedience, loyalty, and silence. Dalton realized too late that Victor had never been interested in curing anything. His only goal had been possession, of bodies, minds, and futures. As time ticked forward, Dalton found himself at a crossroad. He could destroy the lab, but the cost would be fatal. He could run, but the shadows would follow. Or he could betray the man who now controlled every inch of his life. The only question left, was it already too late? In a facility where science had become sorcery and resurrection was a euphemism for ruin, Morgan and Britt remained suspended between life and death, symbols of Victor's unchecked ambition. And somewhere, perhaps watching through a camera feed or waiting in some hidden control room, Victor smiled. Because this chaos, this desperation, this rewriting of identity, wasn't madness to him. It was legacy. What had begun as a covert manipulation, tightly calculated, coldly orchestrated, was now evolving into something uncontainable. The adjustments Victor Cassadine had ordered were never just scientific alterations. They were psychological invasions, fractures carved into the souls of those he had chosen as vessels. As Morgan and Britt slowly resurfaced from the depths of unconsciousness, their returns were not triumphant. They were scattered, trembling echoes of who they once were. And with each passing hour, the madness infecting the lab deepened, transforming Victor's vision into a living nightmare. Morgan, once a young man tormented by bipolar episodes, was now caught in a far more terrifying storm, one not of chemical imbalance but of induced psychological fragmentation. The memories being fed into him by Dalton's neural reprogramming were incomplete, mismatched, blurred at the edges. Faces appeared in his mind without names. Voices whispered in the dark corners of his consciousness, familiar yet threatening. Sometimes he remembered Carly holding him. Sometimes he screamed for Sunny in a language he no longer recognized. But most often, he awoke gasping for air, clawing at invisible restraints, unable to tell if he was alive or still inside the explosion that had supposedly killed him. The sedatives were no longer working. The neural recalibration protocols, once designed to stabilize behavior, were short-circuiting under the weight of Morgan's fractured identity. Victor had miscalculated. Morgan's mind was not a canvas, it was a battlefield. And now that he had been dragged back into the waking world, his chaos was bleeding into everything around him. His pulse spiked erratically. His eyes locked onto surveillance cameras as if he knew he was being watched. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words were chilling in their clarity. I was never gone. You just didn't want to see me. Britt's condition was no less disturbing. Her revival had been smoother, clinically more successful. But what she had gained in physical stability, she had lost in emotional clarity. The version of Britt that moved within the confines of her sterile chamber was not the sharp-tongued, fiercely independent doctor that Port Charles once knew. She was different now, precise, methodical, but hollow. Her responses were robotic. Her emotions, if they surfaced at all, were delayed and disconnected. Dalton had believed she could be reintegrated gradually. But Victor had other plans. He had spliced her neural framework with predictive behavior algorithms, essentially rewriting her instincts to match the version of her he had idolized, not the woman she truly was. Britt, like Morgan, had begun to see things. Hallucinations, disjointed and unnerving, plagued her waking hours. She would stare into mirrors and whisper questions to a reflection that didn't answer. She murmured names, Liesel, Jason, Nicholas, but when prompted, she couldn't explain who they were. And yet, the pain was there, surfacing in flinches and gasps. As if her body remembered every heartbreak her mind had been forced to forget. She would sometimes wake from restless sleep and reach for someone who wasn't there. Where did they put me? She once asked Dalton, her voice cracked and childlike. He had no answer. Only guilt. The madness of these adjustments began to leak into the facility itself. Equipment malfunctioned. Lights flickered as if haunted by the very souls being manipulated within. The staff, most of whom had no knowledge of what Victor was truly doing, began resigning in quiet terror. A nurse disappeared. A tech assistant fled in the night. One junior researcher attempted suicide after hearing Britt sobbing through a vent, repeating the same phrase over and over. I don't want to be perfect. Victor remained unseen. His commands came through encrypted channels, his will translated by AI interfaces that bore no human empathy. But the fingerprints were unmistakable. He was tightening his grip. Dalton was now being forced to administer memory suppression drugs on a rotating schedule. Sleep patterns were monitored to the millisecond. Neural activity logs were sent directly to a server known only as Project Prometheus, a name that struck Dalton with a chill every time it appeared. Victor had always been obsessed with legacy. But now, he was trying to create one from the corpses of the living. Morgan and Britt were no longer people to him. They were prototypes, first drafts of something darker, more obedient, more eternal. And yet, for all his control, he had not accounted for one thing: the human spirit's resistance to being caged. Morgan began to resist. Subtly at first. A refusal to respond to commands. A delay in reaction time. Then more aggressively, tampering with biometric sensors, hiding tools. Communicating with Britt in a whispered language only the two of them understood. Whatever remained of their identities had begun to reawaken. Not fully, and not without pain. But enough to make Victor's entire system tremble with the threat of collapse. Britt, too, began pushing back. Her eyes regained their spark. Her hands, once passive, now twitched with suppressed fury. She started manipulating the biometric control systems from her side of the chamber, rewriting small sequences of code that Dalton hadn't noticed. She was beginning to remember who she was, not just through memory, but through defiance. And in one chilling moment, as she looked into a monitoring camera and simply mouthed, "You don't own me," Dalton knew Victor's experiment had already begun to fail. But failure, in Victor's mind, was not acceptable. And that made him more dangerous than ever. As these mental awakenings began to interfere with the programming, Victor's orders became more ruthless. Increase the dosage. Force behavioral resets. If necessary, initiate full cognitive wipe. Dalton, torn between survival and morality, found himself at the center of a storm he had helped summon. He had allowed the madness in, brick by brick, protocol by protocol. And now, it was consuming everything. Port Charles still believed Morgan was dead. The world had moved on from Britt. But in the shadows, in the twisted corridors of a laboratory ruled by a ghost, both were alive, barely human, barely whole, but still fighting. Their minds were splintered, haunted by broken images and ghost memories, but in those fragments lived the last flickers of resistance. And those flickers might be all that remained to stop Victor Cassidy's grand resurrection from becoming a nightmare that no one could wake up from. Because the adjustments weren't just wrong. They were irreversible. And the madness wasn't spreading anymore. It was winning.